talking to Cornelius. Conversation 21. There are no records that deliver the kind of knowledge that I really want to have about the two of you. Matters of real substance can't be captured on a ledger or written on a certificate. Sometimes they even go unsaid when you directly know a person. There's often a certain reticence that governs how much is revealed. And then, of course, time does its work on experience, edits out the difficult bits, polishes up the bright and happy bits, until all that's left is a hagiography robbed of every ounce of muddy, tangled grace. But we won't go down that road, old man. You deserve better than that, and so do you, Moma. If we share a bond across the ages, I suspect it's found in the muddy, tangled grace of life, rather than in some over-exaggerated ideal. So where does that leave us? Melbourne, 19th of October, 1852. There is the verifiable time and place when you were married. You started your relationship in a town where a man might ride his horse into a bar just for a laugh, where women in garish dresses smoked pipes, fiddlers played the latest hits from California, where gold fever was hot, alcohol flowed in abundance, conmen executed cunning plans, street preachers, commonly known as beardies, prophesied with a sure knowledge they were witnessing the end times. And every street corner was a likely place for yet another lucky digger's extravagant performance. Such was your Melbourne, a bogan paradise, the capital for the new aristocracy. And it was growing rapidly. Stubbs and Son, the Queen Street auctioneers, were looking to offload a great range of new land packages. They had 39 newly released allotments on Brunswick Street, 20 on Nicholson Street, and 255 in an exciting, fast-developing area called Collingwood. They pitched the Collingwood land release as just in time for working classes to benefit by the alteration to the Building Act. That particular change to the Building Act meant less well-off people could make their homes with more affordable materials, like timber. This was not just good news for the Victorian working class, but also the Vandemonian timber industry. There was profit to be made in this fast-developing world that would become inner suburban Melbourne. But the strike of the auctioneer's hammer and the side of Melbourne growing into its now familiar form existed alongside the rougher dimensions of colonial life. October 1852 was a particularly bad month for travelling down St Kilda Road. Bushrangers on the St Kilda Road. On Saturday night, information was given at the police station that 4 mounted and armed bushrangers were committing the most daring depredations on the St Kilda and Brighton Road. About 5 o'clock in the evening, Mr. and Mrs. Borfrey were stopped, bailed up and robbed, and upwards of 15 other persons were also stopped that same evening by the same gang. The Argus, Melbourne, 18th of October, 1852. The St Kilda Road hold-ups were immortalised on canvas 35 years later by the English artist William Strutt, who was in Melbourne at the time of the robberies. The sense of precariousness in the experience of day-to-day life in Melbourne went far beyond the possibility of robbery. In some ways, the place was growing too rapidly. Life was cheap and death was close at hand in an under-policed city. Pleasant times. In the course of one of our usual rides, we yesterday came across the dead body of a child washed ashore about halfway between Leiditz and St Kilda. In trying to find a constable in the latter place to whom to give information on the subject, we found that no such thing as a constable was ever to be found there. We mentioned our object in seeking one when we were told that little notice was taken about such a matter as the discovery of a dead body nowadays. That information had been given to the police of two which had lately been found, but that nobody seemed to trouble themselves about the matter, and that it was believed that one of them was still lying exposed upon the beach. A pretty savage state a community must sink into when human bodies are allowed thus to lie about, unburied and uncared for. The Argus, Melbourne, 28th of October, 1852. It had taken a sum total of 17 years for Melbourne to take on the complex issues of a big city. The corpses on the beaches and the bushranger hold-ups on St Kilda Road were no doubt at the extreme end of those issues. But every person wandering the city streets was assaulted by an all-pervasive problem that also carried life-threatening implications. State of the streets. Melbourne is daily becoming more filthy, and yet daily more means are procurable to alleviate, if not exterminate, this filth. It is impossible to pass along any street, Collins Street perhaps being an exception, without having one's olfactory nerves assailed by the most poisonous stenches, which as the warm weather draws on, become worse and worse. On the west side of Elizabeth Street, the gutter is clogged with refuse thrown from the houses and drainings from the cellars. Burke Street, on the northern side especially, from the post office to Swanston Street, is in a worse condition still. There, dirt having almost become putrid with stagnation. The rights-of-way, so-called, so numerous in this city, are without exception bogs of the worst description. The Argus, Melbourne, 22nd of October, 1852. This bustling, complicated, precarious world was the setting for your courtship and marriage. You were married by Maurice Stack at St Francis Church on Lonsdale Street. The church was functioning as the local Catholic cathedral at the time. The future cathedral up on Eastern Hill was still in the early stages of construction. Stack had arrived in Melbourne as a seminarian from Ireland the year before. He was the first Catholic ordained in Victoria. He ministered across the colony in the years that followed, saying masses in tents on the goldfields and in hotel rooms, raising funds to build the bluestone churches that marked the Catholic presence across Victoria. Stack sometimes laced his sermons with lines in the Irish language. This must have been a consolation for some. It also would have nurtured the sense that the Catholic Church was the place where the identity and experience of the Irish was both understood and protected. Victoria in 1852 was a place where all the elements of an Irish Catholic working class identity were converging. The first Catholic Bishop of Melbourne was a Cork man named James Gould. He had led the defensive charge early in his administration in a particularly vigorous sectarian battle in 1850. It should come as no surprise that the focus of the battle was immigration. Some things never change. A Melbourne City Council alderman with the appropriate name Kerr had made a resolution in the chamber opposing any further arrivals of Irish orphan immigrants. They might have survived a famine, but that didn't entitle them to a welcome in Victoria, where they'd be good for nothing and always looking for a handout. He reserved a heftier portion of his spite for the female Irish immigrants who were already living in Melbourne. A more useless or a more depraved set were not to be found, he said, while their personal appearance rendered them ineligible to fill the ranks of prostitution. The Melbourne Daily News, 22nd of April, 1850. This was a particularly ugly example of an anti-Irish attitude that later found expression on the comic pages of periodicals like The Bulletin. There you would regularly find bulbous-nosed Paddy, eternally drunk, mangling the language, and stuck in some conundrum of his own stupid making. And there you would also find an apron-wearing Bridget, a lazy housemaid or cook, terrorising all and sundry with a rolling pin raised to strike and a banshee-like holler. It was a particularly Australian style of vilification. "Only joking, Paddy. Can't you take a joke?" All of this was your world, old man, when you were 26, standing before the altar at St. Francis and putting a ring on the finger of Bridget Lyons from County Clare. I recall a cousin once told a story she had heard. She said, "You were so full of joy when you came out of St. Francis that you tossed your hat in the air and it flew over the fence." I like that story. I hope it's true. I can see you there, a wedding party of bride and groom and witnesses, maybe hailing a horse-drawn cab on Lonsdale Street, looking for a fiddler to climb on board and strike up some tune. I dare say something Irish rather than Californian. And off you went, old man, no longer alone. Joy in the moment, and no idea of what lay in store in the future.